From deep in the heart of West Texas, it's the Tim Kreitz Adventures Podcast. Talking motorcycles, music, beer brewing, pop culture, adventure, and all points in between. Now, here's your host, Tim Kreitz.
Greetings and salutations to each and every one of you out there, and welcome to another installment of the podcast. Man, oh man, do we have a hot and controversial motor topic to discuss today. This is something I have wanted to discuss for a long time, but wasn't exactly sure how to approach it initially. And you obviously know what I'm driving at already, presuming you read the title. We're going to talk about riding impaired in this episode. Any reasonable person out there should agree that riding impaired is an absolutely terrible idea. But lots of motorcyclists do it, and at a rate almost twice that of car drivers. Why is this? Well, in hopes of answering that question, what I want to touch on and discuss today is the popular notion put forth by certain interests in the motorcycle world, and one that is regularly, sometimes religiously proselytized, that consuming any amount of alcohol over any period of time while out riding your motorcycle is unacceptable and irresponsible. For many, many years, I was the guy who would tell you emphatically that notion was true. But is it? And is that attitude actually somehow contributing to the problem of riding impaired? We'll talk about it from exactly where I believe the argument might derive. Along the way, we'll dig into some of the science and the social mores comprising this issue and attempt to look at it as objectively as possible. Okay, so first, forward to all of this. The hard data comprising the number of motorcycle crashes that involve the consumption of alcohol on someone's part is compelling. As some of you may know, I spent about a decade teaching motorcycle safety courses for the Motorcycle Safety Foundation through the Texas Department of Public Safety's Motorcycle Safety Unit. And I'm well acquainted with this information and with the frequency of alcohol-involved motorcycle accidents, according to agencies like the NHTSA, for example. Now, the numbers are riveting, and they likely are a big part of why certain members of the motorcycle community are so quick to slap a scarlet letter on anyone who stops for a beer when out on his or her motorcycle. So let's go over some of the statistics, and then let's do some critical thinking. The first and perhaps the most hypnotic stat is that in almost half of all motorcycle fatalities, the deceased rider is found to have some amount of detectable alcohol in his or her system. According to the NHTSA, it's between 45 and 47%, depending on what year you're looking at. Also, according to the MSF, alcohol is involved in over half of all accidents involving a motorcycle on some person's part. Maybe it's the rider or perhaps another involved party. Lastly, a quarter of all fatal alcohol-related motorcycle crashes involve motorcyclists running off the road, overturning, or falling from the motorcycle rather than striking another object. So just by virtue of this data, it would certainly seem that alcohol use is damn near ubiquitous in the motorcycle world. On the face of it, motorcycle riders as a whole apparently like to drink alcohol, and at a higher frequency than that of non-riders. But why? After all, alcohol is only a factor in like 28% of fatal accidents where motorcycles are not involved. What makes riding and drinking go so well together? And is it completely impossible to combine these two activities safely? I have a theory on this. Firstly, we know that motorcycle riders tend to be thrill seekers and risk takers in their own right. I know I am. Even the safest, most conscientious rider accepts and manages a higher level of risk than the average motorist, and is, at least in part, doing so for the reward of the endorphins and dopamine riding a motorcycle provides. It's a wonderful feeling. If you ride a motorcycle, you know exactly that feeling I'm talking about. It's one of those mental states you get from riding a bike that makes the experience impossible to articulate and explain to non-riders. The thing is, we see similar compulsion in all risk takers, from high-stakes gamblers to wing walkers. And what is an almost universal propensity within this personality type? You guessed it, it's substance abuse. The characteristic of risk-taking or novelty-seeking is one personality trait that is very often found in persons who become addicted to drugs and alcohol. One study even showed that if thrill-seeking and low-harm avoidance are shown in 11-year-olds, the boys in particular have a 20-fold increased risk of abusing alcohol by like age 27. So dopamine seekers, endorphin seekers, they can easily be drawn to both motorcycles and alcohol for a lot of the same payoff. Some of these are even the same people who, after kicking alcoholism or drug abuse later in life, they'll become like gym rats. They channel their addictive behavior into cardio and weightlifting because they'll always need those endorphins and that dopamine, but are now getting it in a less harmful way. That's my theory on why so many motorcyclists drink compared to regular motorists, and it's perhaps why they like combining the two activities with such frequency. And there's also a social aspect to this. Drinking tends to be a social activity, and motorcycling also tends to be a social activity. You combine that with a propensity for wanting endorphins and wanting dopamine, and you've got a bit of a combination there, don't you? All right, so with that in mind, let's get back to the original question. Is there a way to solve this problem without telling this demographic of riders, hey man, you better not have one drop of alcohol while you're out on your motorcycle? Because obviously that doesn't work, does it? Hollister was over 60 years ago, and motorcyclists are still drinking and riding despite organizations like, I mentioned the NHTSA, the MSF, MAD, etc. It goes on and on, using alcohol scare tactics for decades. I'm sure that half of all riders aren't alcoholics, so wouldn't it be better to provide motorcyclists with a realistic look at how to safely combine the activities of riding and having a beer or something without getting on the bike impaired? Can it be done? It's an iconoclastic and somewhat heretical thought to even utter. I realize that. So when you drink alcohol, it goes to pretty much every part of your body, including obviously your heart and brain. This is where it has the most noticeable effects. You become slightly high and relaxed, and your blood pressure and your pulse go down. Everybody knows this. Eventually, the liver breaks the alcohol down into acetates, and it's expelled. Depending on the size and ethnicity of the person, that process usually takes about 40 minutes to an hour per average-sized drink, such as a regular beer. After that point, there's no alcohol in the person's system anymore. It's gone. So I know this is going to sound very taboo, but it seems to me that it's perfectly okay to meet your riding pals somewhere for a beer or two, enjoy some fun and conversation, all that kind of good stuff, then wait the appropriate amount of time for the alcohol to become acetate in your system before climbing back on your bike and going home or wherever. You just need good information and enough discipline to be able to do it successfully. If discipline fails and you drink a little more than you planned, leave the bike there and get an Uber. It's okay. There's no shame in it. In fact, that should be respected. If you ever watch my buddy Josh on the Shade Tree Surgeon channel, he does that all the time. He and his friends do that all the time. They go out, they'll go to some breweries, they will have a beer or two, and then sometimes they drink too much. And what do you always see in that video? You see Josh going back the next day to get his bike. It can be done. But that's not what is being taught and encouraged in this age of zero tolerance, political correctness, and nannyism mentality. The general narrative is that the problem is so big that any amount of alcohol on a ride is completely irresponsible and should be avoided, or the motorcyclist is a bad person. And I'll tell you straight up, that attitude doesn't sit well with or encourage responsible drinking among the ranks of the thrill seekers. You can forget it. It falls on deaf ears every time and influences no one to be more responsible with alcohol while out on a ride. It's immediately blown off as being goody-goody or prude or puritanical, which should be obvious when considering that the problem hasn't gotten any better since ever. From everything I have seen and heard and read, there is very little to no encouragement to understand alcohol as a chemical and how to manage it. And there's no emphasis in the argument on alcohol's effect on us as individuals. That's hugely important. In fact, we're not even really allowed to be individuals anymore, which is perhaps another subject altogether, but pointing out the differences between individuals has become dangerous business in recent years. In some places, you're not even allowed to point out the basic difference between males and females. So imagine someone pointing out that one of the factors greatly determining alcohol metabolism in individuals is race and ethnicity. Forget that it's a fact based on genetics. You're just not allowed to point this stuff out anymore. And that's how we get to where we are on an issue like drinking and driving or riding a motorcycle impaired. You can't talk about anything other than the legalistically safe, socially acceptable solution to the problem, which is always one size fits all, every time. The fact is that individuals all react to alcohol differently based on gender, weight, genetics, race and ethnicity, among other things. A BAC of 0.02 or even 0.05 might have close to zero discernible effect on one person while it smashes someone else into full-on drunkenness. But we've removed the personal responsibility dynamic from these issues and govern them with cookie-cutter logic. And so the problem continues to get worse. From what I've been able to discern, it seems like any sort of positive change with regard to this issue starts with knowing oneself and rebuilding a culture centered on personal responsibility with true consequences for screwing up. You want to stop people from riding impaired or driving impaired? Emphasize and share all the information about alcohol more openly and remove some of the taboos. And sure, make the penalties for harming others through irresponsible action more dire and more frightening. That'll have an effect. I guarantee you, it always does in every culture where it's tried. But what if we were to approach riding impaired like we approach teaching safer sex practices to teenagers? How well did teaching abstinence work compared to being real with teens about safer sex? Well, pretty much all the data is in on that subject too, and guess what? Teaching safer sex is more effective, like it or not. And it makes sense. It makes more sense to tell a teenager, hey, look, you, among other things, are, to an extent, you are a sexual creature, and you're going to have to deal with this stuff. And here are all your options on how to deal with it. Doesn't that make sense? Yet, all 50 states have instead implemented largely abstinence-based sex education. I see a parallel situation with this whole impaired riding problem that the motorcycle world has been struggling with for decades that keeps getting worse. What if we instead put more emphasis on practices and techniques designed to help riders make safer decisions about alcohol use rather than just telling them not to drink? Hey, look, among other things, you're a thrill seeker, you're a novelty seeker, and you like to ride motorcycles and you like to drink. So here are all your options on how to safely deal with this dynamic of your personality. I mean, I'm sure it wouldn't be perfect, but as with safer sex education, it might actually make a difference for once. Who knows? Is it worth a try? By the way, I keep saying safer sex instead of safe sex because no such practice will ever be perfect, especially something like that. Mr. Webster defines safety as the absence of risk. And we all know that virtually nothing in life is ever done in the absence of risk. Risk takers know this. And that's why they roll their eyes when you get up on your high horse and tell them they're terrible human beings for riding their motorcycles to the burger barn and having a beer or two with their lunch, or going to the motorcycle bike night at the dealership and having a couple of beers. Actually, I don't recommend doing that at all for a variety of reasons. Number one, a lot of times they're just trying to get you loosened up a little bit. They're trying to grease your gears a little bit so they can maybe sell you a motorcycle or an expensive jacket or an expensive hat or something like that. So that's something to be aware of. Has actually nothing to do with the subject other than you may be getting manipulated in those situations. Now, granted, some idiots get blithering drunk and go for a ride. That's true. I get it. It's a real thing. And I have no doubt that a certain amount of that behavior is definitely reflected in the NHTSA and MSF data. There's no doubt about it. But we genuinely need to approach this problem in a different way if we are serious about changing it. Because what we're doing now, it's not working. Motorcyclists are generally not boring homebodies whose idea of an exciting evening is drinking weak tea and watching The Voice. We need a different plan here. But until we figure it out, I guess drinking and riding is unfortunately going to continue to be a problem, as will a plethora of other related social problems. I mean, it's bigger than just this. We all understand that, I think. But in the meantime, don't dismiss the idea. Just think about it. Maybe you are the one, you out there listening. You're the one who will come up with a viable solution to this problem. Alrighty then, if you dropped by just to hear me rant on this subject alone, you can go ahead and tune out now, but I do want to say a couple of words of thanks. We had, right here in Midland, Texas, last week, the very first ever Tim Kreitz Adventures fan night. I couldn't believe it. We met at this little coffee house in old Midtown Midland, and a bunch of people showed up for it, and I couldn't believe that anybody wanted to do that. But we had a great time, and it made me feel really good. I've had this channel as a motorcycle channel for like 5.5 years now, and of that 5.5 years doing this channel as a motorcycle channel, I've been down on the channel and depressed about it for about 4.5 of those 5.5 years because it has always just performed poorly. But that was a shot in the arm. It was something that made me want to keep doing this and kind of fired me back up. It was neat. So thanks to everybody who showed up for that, and look forward to doing it again. It actually gave me a little bit of motivation to sort of refresh the channel in some way. Every year, at the end of the year when I do my year in review special, I always talk about how I'm going to make big changes to the channel in the coming year and how this is going to be different and that's going to be different. And then I don't do any of it. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm fired up enough this time around and things have settled down in my life enough to where in the coming year I really can do something I've never done before and fundamentally add some new compelling dynamic to the channel. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for tuning in. As always, if you want to connect with me on social media, you are welcome to do that at The Real Tim Kreitz on Facebook and at Tim Kreitz Adventures on Instagram. As always, I would love for you to subscribe to this channel and hit that little bell. Not that it apparently does any freaking good at this point, because everybody tells me they don't get notifications anymore and that they have the bell selected. YouTube is broken. Actually, YouTube's not broken. They're just devious and evil, and they're determined to make sure that life is a living hell for the small creator. But we will get around that one way or another. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. See you next time.